Tēnā tātou katoa I tēnei ata. Nau mai, haere mai, ki roto I tēnei wānanga Ipurangi, mo te kaupapa o Tiriti Futures. Um, Haru ko ana tēnā kau, tēnei ata, ki te wānanga, I enei wānanga, e pāna ki te mano o te tiriti o Waitangi, te oranga o te iwi, me nā āhuatanga o nā mahi he o te karauna I nā wā o mua, tainoa ki tēnei rā hoki. He hohununa kōrero, he whakahirahira nā whakaaro, nō reira me ū tātou I te kaupapa o te tika me te pono, te whakaaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa, me te maungarongo ki runga I te matua o te unua. Nā reira, ka karakia au, kia timata ai I tēnei wānanga o tātou. E tau nei ki rungi a tātou katoa, te wairoa o nā mātua tūpuna, nā rātau I whakatakato te ara, hei hikoenga mō tātou nā uri. I whakatō ki a tātou nā kau ki ngā tikanga, hei ara takingi a tātou. Kia nā kau nui ki te hāpai a tātou mai katoa, I roto I te pono, I te tika, I te māramatanga, me te aroha o tēti ki tēti. E rongo whake iria ke koe ki runga, tūturu o, I te whakamaua kia tēnā, tēnā. Aupie uie, tai ki e.
Kia ora, Jack. Mōrena koutou katoa tēnā koe e hoa for your karakia and your mihi. I'd just like to support Jack's mihi and karakia to open this session, which is called Reconciliation and the Complexity of Sorry. This is an important subject for Aotearoa, always has been and probably always will. In a colonial country built on breaches of te tiriti and racism, this is a highly charged subject. But first of all, I'd like to welcome you to this process. So we're going for an hour and a half, and we have a code for our listeners and participants so that we can respect each other. The code of Te Tiriti Futures, which is to be curious, open, respectful, be generous, confidential, speak from our experience. No one knows everything. Make space, take space. We don't take ourselves too seriously. We don't have to be perfect and articulate all the time. But whether you're sending us questions or participating as panelists ourselves, we will abide by this code so that we can have the best of what our powerful panelists are bringing to this kaupapa. Thanks, everybody. You can put questions into the Q&A later. As you see, there's accessibility information. This is really, really important so that it is available to all through universal design, to what extent we can do that, but also through specifics. So these are some specifics here so that to try and meet more, probably not everyone, but more people's needs. Okay, so welcome again, everybody. What our format's going to be is we're going to have 3 speakers, and they're going to primarily introduce themselves, but I'm going to start by just mihing to them and recognizing them. He mihi Jack, so Jack McDonald, taranaki whānui me whakatohia. Jack has been a colleague of mine for many years, and despite his young years, he spent 10 years virtually working in the Parliament around treaty settlements, policy, media, and many other issues. So welcome to you, Jack. I'd also like to welcome Annabelle Ahuriri Driscoll, Ngāti Parau, Ngāti Kahanunu, me Ngāti Kouwhata, me Rangatani, who is working in the space around the Royal Commission, redress, etc., and who has a stellar career as well as a personal experience for which we really need for this conversation. I'd finally like to, not finally, but with great respect, welcome our friend Josiah Tualamalili, who is of NZ Samoan descent and is a Pacific youth advocate and social justice advocate and researcher, and has a lot to say in this space and a beautiful voice in his communities as well as the whole country. So we're very privileged this morning to have all of them. I'm Catherine Delahunty. I'm Pākehā Tūturu. My job here is to facilitate the voices who need to be heard, and to, along with the rest of us who are not Indigenous or not tangata moana, to listen to this kōrero. So what we're going to do is start off with Jack. We're looking at the issues of sorry and reconciliation through three lenses. One is tangata whenua, one is tangata Pacifica, one is the survivors of state abuse. And so they're all different lenses, and we're going to just start with you, Jack. And first of all, our panelists are going to give us their initial opening 10 minutes or so of their thoughts and knowledge and wisdom about the complexity of the concepts of sorry and redress in this country. So Jack, if you'd like to kick us off, that would be awesome.
Ai, ka pai. Kia ora no tātou. Heuri tēnei o Taranaki Maunga, ko Taranaki Tūturu, ko Te Atiawa, ko Te Pakakohi Ngā Iwi. Whakawhitia atu rā ki a Pōtiki mai tawhiti, he uri au o te whakatohea, Ngāti Rua Tākena hoki. I tupu ake au ki konei ki te takutai o Kāpiti, i runga i te whenua o Ngāti Haumia ki Pai Kākariki, ko Jack McDonald tōku ingoa, and he tika nā kōrero o Catherine i te nuinga o taku oranga, he mahi tō rangapu, he mahi whakau kaupapa. Nā kaupapa o te Tiriti o Waitangi, nā kaupapa Māori, nā kaupapa o te Taiao. Nō reira, tēnā tātou katoa. So I guess in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, I really want to focus on the how the Crown has used the treaty settlement process, and more specifically the concept of apology, and the Crown apology in particular, really as a way, in my view, of distracting from and undermining the central struggle that is expressed within those processes, which is the fight for tino rangatiratanga, and the fight for the retention and return of whenua Māori. If we go back in history, really the struggle for tino rangatiratanga in a post-colonial context is a struggle for sovereignty and a struggle for land. And if I look at my own whakapapa, in the 1850s, my people of Taranaki called a national hui in South Taranaki. They constructed a wharenui specifically for that purpose, Taiporo He Nui, and that was one of the early meetings of that formed the Kingitanga movement. And at that hui, the call was for the retention of our land, that no further land should be sold. What that was labelled by the Crown was a land league, but what it really was a legitimate assertion of tribal autonomy and ownership rights. And so the call that went out from that hui was te tangata tōmua, te whenua tōmuri, by the death of men will the land be taken. And so all of the actions that followed in the New Zealand wars, including in Aotearoa Taranaki, whether it was the Waitara War, the resistance of Titoko Waru, or the non-violent resistance of our tupuna at Parihaka, was all about trying to retain the land, which was the basis and remains the basis for our tino rangatiratanga and for self-determination, but also self-sufficiency. If you can't have land, you can't self-determine your future, and you can't be self-sufficient for your people. So despite our struggle, despite our resistance, whether that was through those wars, whether it was through the court system, Te Koti Tango Whenua, the land stealing court. Through all of those processes, Māori were left with less than 5% of our land. And so what has kind of become known as the Māori Renaissance started in the 1970s with the struggle of activists like Ngā Tamatoa, the Māori Land March in 75, led by Dame Whenua Kupa. And as a result of that burst of activism, we really were able to begin the process of regaining our power and our culture in this whenua, whether it was through the Kohanga Reo movement and the Kurakopa Māori movement, whether it was through education more broadly, and also the establishment of the Waitangi Tribunal in 1975, but also the backdating of historical claims back to 1840s, so that injustice could be heard and redress could be made. I think that was mandated in 1984. And since then, since that decision was made to look at historical claims, up until last year, there was essentially a bipartisan consensus on the Treaty of Waitangi and on settlements. And that consensus essentially said that we will work to honour these historical treaty claims. And as part of that, there will be a Crown apology, there will be financial redress, there will be some cultural redress, and we will use this process to essentially say that these settlements will be full and final. This is despite the fact that Crown policies such as the large natural groupings policy, for those who haven't heard that concept, that essentially means that the Crown will only negotiate with large iwi, not with hapu, and it was hapu, of course, who signed Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Many iwi are confederations of hapu, and so that in itself was a tactic used to divide and rule our people, and that has meant that many legitimate claims have not been heard, and that in itself is a further breach of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. But the other thing that the other policy that was implemented was essentially that, one, that private land could not be returned in any shape or form. And of course, the vast majority of land that was taken by the Crown or by other means is in private ownership. But even when it comes to lands that are in Crown ownership, such as the conservation estate or local government land, very rarely has that land ever been returned. And you see outrageous examples of cases sometimes where land in a settlement might be returned for 24 hours and then it has to be returned back to the Crown. So all of these policies taken together essentially are a way of undermining the central unifying struggle of tangata whenua, which is to get our land back as a basis for self-determination and self-sufficiency. And so, by the way, Catherine, I can rant for ages, so when my time is up, please let me know. But when it comes to Crown apologies, which is kind of the basis for our wānanga today, and the idea of saying sorry, I don't want to deny everyone's experience, because for some that apology is important, and many of our kaumātua and our tupuna have fought for decades and centuries even for an acknowledgement of the pain and suffering that was caused by Crown actions. But in my view, there is very little meaning behind that apology. What is more important is reconciliation and redress. And in the last kind of maybe 5 to 10 years, when Christopher Finlayson was the Treaty Settlement Minister and Andrew Little after him, there were some really positive developments in the treaty negotiation space, and some new precedents set. For example, the return of Rangiriri, which was one of the most important sites in the New Zealand land wars, was returned to Waikato Tainui outside of a treaty settlement process. And there was also the Pariaka reconciliation process, which I can speak more to, given my whakapapa, although I was not involved in that process at all. But essentially, what happened there was, yes, an apology, and one that was, I guess, separate from a settlement process, because Parihaka was a meeting place of many iwi. It wasn't part of one, so it wasn't part of one iwi settlement. But more importantly, there was it was the beginning of a process, and that process came with resource, and the ability to try and build an economic base and future for our people. And so,
Jack, sorry, probably we're getting near the last beginning of your opening, and then you can come back to this.
Cool.
Yep.
Kapai. So just in closing, we're now in a really challenging space with this new government, whereby that new precedent has essentially been pushed out the window, and we are now looking at just fighting for the very basic foundations of redress and of reconciliation. But I guess the main message that I want to leave with you before closing is that we cannot let the concepts of apology as a way of distracting us from what redress and reconciliation is actually about, which is about tino rangatiratanga. It's about getting our land back as a basis for self-determination and self-sufficiency. Kia ora tātou.
Oh, kia ora, Jack. Thank you so much. And what a thorough and inspiring grounding in what this kaupapa is about. I really appreciated it. And I want to hear more. We will hear more. So thank you so much, Ngā mihi. I'm going to jump now to Josiah and ask you to talk about the experience of Tangata Moana in relation to a couple, I think, of Crown apologies. Kia ora.
Yep, tēnā koe whai, Captain. Tēnā rawa atu koe matua Jack. E te atua nau te kore te mana whenua o tēnei rohi a tēnā koe, nai tuahuriri tēnā koe. Moi mai rā, pui mano Norman tui a sau. Ko vai te maunga, ko vai lima te aua, ko Aotearoa piti pāpi te tō waka, no otapo te ahau, ke otatahi no ana, o ranga tangata, o ranga pāre toki mahi, ko Josiah tāwi te tōku ingoa. Malo lava le sufua maua malangi mama. It's lovely to have some time with you all. As I acknowledged in the reo, I'm calling you from Ngāi Tuahuriri land, and I live here in Ōtautahi, but I spent some of my upbringing in Ōtapoti. We're of Samoan whakapapa. Our villages are Lepa, Sanalesi, Satuiatua, Whanaloa, and we came here via a few elements, and I'll talk to you about that, and also through our Irish and Scottish and Polish whakapapa. But my grandma was born in 1936 in Samoa. She's still alive, which we're very grateful for. She came to Aotearoa for her schooling in the 1950s in Auckland, and she returned home, and my dad moved here, and our whānau started to live here in Aotearoa in the 1980s. But the reason I start with my grandmother is because in 1936, New Zealand was the administrator of Samoa, and I'd like to just talk a little bit about the history to the two apologies that are sort of intertwined in my kōrero, as Matua Jack has done, because I'm not assuming we'll any level of knowledge. I just want us to start the kōrero from a base of So when I was young, my community taught us and teach many of our young people to be distrustful of government, and particularly to be wary about how much we can trust authority, and not always told why. And so it wasn't until I was at university where I got a better understanding of some of the history. And then it wasn't until the Dawn Raids apology, which my friends and I and our elders called for, that my auntie told me that she was directly connected. So as a sense, some of the impacts of these things our communities are only able to talk about in very certain circumstances, and some of it is only happening now, even though these things are very deep wounds. But to jump right back, historian Damon Salesa, he talks about that in the late 1800s, New Zealand leaders wanted to have our own Pacific colonial empire. And in 1901, the Cook Islands and Niue became colonies of New Zealand and later protectorates. And New Zealand became the administrator of Tokelau in 1926 and formally became part of New Zealand in 1949. In 1914, the first action of the First World War, New Zealand troops were sent to capture, at that time, German Samoa, and New Zealand administered Samoa until we became independent in 1962. And so, as I mentioned, my grandmother was born during that period, which at times was extremely horrific. In 1918, we had the ship that was led into Samoa with influenza that killed about a fifth of our population, predominantly our providers, our breadwinners, and many other things, including suppression of our independence and cultural enhancement movements. And that was apologised for by Prime Minister Helen Clark in 2002 at the independence celebrations for Samoa. Jumping forward a bit to the just after the Second World War, when New Zealand needed more labourers, certain immigration laws were waived as employers and communities cried out for more workers, and the government listened. And that also in this context, it's important to remember that Niueans, Cook Islanders and Tokelauans had access to free movement in New Zealand, and that hasn't gone away since that time because of the constitutional situation. And as many of us know, in 1974, the Dawn Raids period began under the National Party, carried under the Labour government, and then carried on under the national government again, where for political convenience, Pacific peoples were blamed for the global challenges around oil prices and economic needs of our communities. And there was blame against wider peoples of colour, and Māori were affected through that too. During this period, our communities made up 1/3 of undocumented peoples in Aotearoa. Former race relations conciliator Joris Debris in his analysis found 86% of those prosecuted and arrested were Pacific people. So it was very clearly racist targeting. The raids were conducted in Auckland, Wellington, Canterbury, and Invercargill, and other parts of Aotearoa. We are still only finding out the impact of it as the historical record's being written right now. But we know that Pacific people at that time were told to carry ID to show that you had the right to be in Aotearoa, and Moriori, Māori, and peoples of colour were randomly stopped in the street and questioned about their identity and whether they were allowed to be here. And again, going back to what I said before, this includes Niueans, Cook Islanders, Tokelauans who were New Zealand citizens and had free movement, and also had the context of Samoa, which we'll come back to. And in 2020, the Polynesian Panther Party, the Legacy Trust, and Ngā Tamatoa and other leaders called for an apology on behalf of our communities. And so in early 2021, I put out a call to young people and communities asking that we would write letters to the government supporting our elders who called for the apology. And then my friend Benji Timu and I wrote a petition which we took to Parliament, which had 7,366 signatures. Another part of the apology is, and this is one of the elements we were nervous about, was that, okay, one government might give the apology, but actually this was a series of governments, and the impact of the apology needs to be protected for future. So we asked that Parliament have a special debate, and every party would speak in support of the apology, because we were concerned that it could be lost to the future politics. And so on 1st of August, the Dawn Raids apology was given, and that was a very special time for many in our community. And then on August 10th, the special debate on the Dawn Raids was held at Parliament. Young people and communities really wanted not just to be in the community where the apology was heard, but in the records of the House where the rhetoric was spun that incensed and enabled the racism to happen, that it was written into that record book in Hansard, the parliamentary records too. Just quickly to the impact. For many of our elders, the apology was extremely meaningful. Perception study done by the Pacific Cooperation Foundation of more than 2,300 New Zealanders said that 85% of New Zealanders were aware of the events surrounding the Dawn raids at that time, which was quite amazing opportunity for education. 63% of Pacific peoples they talked to supported the formal apology and believed it created a positive impact. So that gives you a sense that, you know, while for many it was important and helpful, some have many different views on it. Hard to put a number, but some in our community can't accept the apology. There are some outstanding elements. Her Royal Highness Princess Mele Putapili of Tonga, she spoke, because this apology in particular wasn't just an apology to people living in residents of New Zealand. It's to people in the Pacific region who were deported illegally, who had citizenship, people who have had their whole lives changed for the last 50 years. So this has had an impact, a long-term impact on our diplomacy and foreign affairs. And this is what she said, and she's now passed, but she said, Right Honourable Jacinda Ardern, the apology is a move in the right direction, and the right direction of the healing process is beginning of a caring and closer and better relationship between your government and future leaders and our Pacific peoples at large. The gifts are significant, very significant. Indeed, it symbolises the government intention to mend the vow with my communities. In that regard, I accept the apology. However, the VAR could be better and complete should the government promptly respond to the immigration needs of our community. Other leaders who have passed as well, Wimaira Anana Piso Collins, he and others have called, and as I have consistently, for repeal of the Western Samoa Citizenship Act, because community members took a case through the courts to the Privy Council in 1982, as one of our Samoan community members was attempting to be deported in the connection with the Dawn raids for being an overstayer. But Samoans were New Zealand citizens through the acts of the time from 1924 to 48. And so there's some unresolved context there. And then a few other things. Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, I'd just like to mihi to them and say, thank you so very much for the alofa, for hosting the apology, for the blessing of that space for our mātua and community to be together. They led and support the 1-year commemoration of the apology, and sort of helpful and kaitiaki of our community stories and community space. And to bring us to the last thing, as many of you know, in the last year, we found that tactics resembling the Dawn raids have been ongoing, and Chinese families, Fijian, Indian, Indonesian, Malaysian, Samoan and Tongan have been experiencing tactics of out of hours visits by Immigration New Zealand staff. A rapid review was done by lawyer Michael Heron and Jane Barrow in June last year, and they said if the government wished to change the relatively rare practice of early morning compliance visits to residential premises, it had the opportunity to do so by either changing the law relevant or Immigration New Zealand practice. We acknowledged there were other priorities at the time, and after the apology that the pandemic meant that deportation activity would not have been on the mind for the government. My community hopes that it's on the mind of the government now, and that apology meant so much to so many that I don't think it's been cheapened, but I think that we will wait to see how meaningful the apology is with these elements that get addressed or don't get addressed. And this year is the 50 years since Dawn raids began. So the next 3 years is a period of, deep commemoration for our Pacific communities. The loss of Fuimano Norman Tuiasau, who, as I mentioned at the beginning, who's one of the Polynesian Panthers Matua, who helped call for the apology and had led many, many years of advocacy alongside Ngāi Tamatoa and others. Yeah, that's all for now. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Josiah. That was an incredible education beyond the headlines, which I think we all really needed, and really gives a context for where we take this conversation after we hear from Annabelle. And Annabelle, I'd just like to invite you now to present your perspective, which I know will be as powerful as what we've just heard. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Okay, tēnā koutou katoa, kei te mihi ki a koutou kua hui mai nei I tēnei ata. Before I begin, I want to be clear about my position because this is a core principle of working in this space. Who am I in relation to this kaupapa? I'm an adopted person. I'm Māori, I'm an adoptee, activist and researcher, and I've had the privilege of contributing with other survivors to the design of redress for survivors of abuse and care. Today, I'm speaking from my own lived experience, also professional experience, but not as a spokesperson. I am a voice. There are many others speaking in various fora that also deserve to be heard. I also want to note that while I'm drawing distinctions today between closed adoption and removal to state and faith-based care, we all come under the scope of survivors within the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care, and therefore redress and apology. So while there is considerable diversity among the survivor community and our experiences, what we share is the heavy hand of the state in our early lives that resulted in various harms and losses. So closed adoption and abuse in state and faith-based care are critical parts of our history, only very recently acknowledged through the Royal Commission. It's taken nearly 70 years for us to reach this place, in part because our colonial history remains an uncomfortable truth. And this is evident in the two examples we've heard today of the long time coming of apologies associated with treaty settlements and the Dawn raids. So closed adoption was introduced at a time when increasing numbers of children and young people were being removed to state and faith-based care. This was part of cleaning up the messiness of post-war, increasingly urban society, a period of economic and social rebuilding, and the cultivation of productive families and citizens. For whānau who lost tamariki and mokopuna via these mechanisms, this was an extension of, rather than a departure from, the colonialism that had sought to dismantle Māori society, but now in the guise of assimilation and integration. And it's the supposedly softer logic of elimination that has prevailed in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Through purporting to pursue equality between colonizer and colonized, settler colonialism supersedes rather than reproduces the colonial rule of difference. And so what this means for us is that colonized people's subordination can be denied, colonized subjectivities are erased, and colonialism itself can also be denied. And so in many ways, closed adoption reproduces settler colonialism. It's a microcosm. The legal fiction in Section 16 of the Adoption Act 1955 renders an adopted child as if born to their adoptive parents, while permanently severing the child's birth relationships and erasing their birth identity. And that was then upheld through secrecy and the sealing of birth records. So the adoptive differentness of adopted child and family is denied in law. The associated experience is dismissed. And like colonialism or assimilation, the adoption itself is then rationalized through narratives of for their own good or in their best interests, with adoptive parents as rescuers of unwanted children who ought to be grateful for their fortunate adoption. In the case of admission to state and faith-based care, children didn't necessarily lose their legal or birth identities, but many were made state wards. The state or affiliated organisation painted as their rescuer from unfortunate circumstances or unfit families. In reality, however, for a significant number, the state was an uncaring and abusive parent. State wards were also removed from biological whānau, disconnected in various ways from whakapapa, so those relationships were severed and life trajectories forever changed. And I just want to draw a connection to Ani Mikairi's presentation yesterday, where she talked about the success of colonisation requiring Māori disappearance. And so adoption and removal of tamariki to state and faith-based care achieve this in a new way. So for Māori and non-Māori children alike, to the number of approximately 250,000, were significantly harmed via closed adoption and removal to state and faith-based care, some suffering the most horrific abuse, neglect, and it has been found, torture. So international agreements that our government later became signatory to, the United Nations Convention for the Rights of the Child, UNDRIP, most certainly breached, as was our own government's Bill of Rights passed in 1990. And for Māori survivors, overlaying or underlying these harms were clear breaches of te tiriti in terms of the promises of honourable kāwanatanga, tino rangatiratanga over taonga, including tamariki and kāinga, and equal or equitable rights of citizenship. So there's an awful lot to say sorry for. And yet, where there should have been words of remorse, there have instead been self-serving narratives and silences. The silence of the Crown with respect to child removal and abuse and care has been discussed as a form of willful forgetting, a denial in order to not be confronted with or remember uncomfortable histories. For wider society, the erasure of history is achieved through, as Carolyn Morris notes, the simple but effective strategy of not talking about it, which leads to not knowing about it. Collective forgetting is ultimately realised through the replacement of these events of history with master narratives. And if we finish the title of Elizabeth Stanley's book on abuse and state care, The Road to Hell, we can understand part of the story that the state and its agents told themselves, that there were good intentions, and if there were, that was good enough. This abhorrent treatment of children and young people is at odds with how we see ourselves as a society that is as benevolent, egalitarian, humanitarian, and compassionate. And this discrepancy is something that we have to reconcile. On the other hand, not being remembered, not having a place in the collective historical memory, not being recognised or narrated is to be silenced. And this has certainly been the experience of adopted people, or being misrecognised, misrepresented, and narrated only as the end result of the consequences of adoption or abuse and care, as a perpetrator in the cases of those who found themselves in gangs or on the pipeline to prison, or a broken person for dealing with the effects of trauma. This too silences in a different way, confining survivors to a marginal, spoiled identity that's all too easily disparaged or ignored. So a critical step forward is to narrate where there has been silence, to represent where there has been misrepresentation. And so in this regard, the Royal Commission has been a key mechanism for truth-seeking and truth-telling. Survivors have been able to provide testimony of the harms they've endured, and institutional representatives have been required to testify to their institution's role in perpetuating abuse. It would be inaccurate to suggest that what emerges is a forensic singular truth, and indeed, this isn't the ultimate end goal. Each person's account, a blend of fact and narrative, becomes a truth in its own right. The importance of one's story and experience being reflected in the public record cannot be understated. But there are other important purposes for this compilation of traumatic memories, including providing a basis for further investigation of individual cases, introducing survivors' experiences into the broader societal consciousness so that prevailing narratives can be confronted and rethought, holding groups and structures accountable for the harms, and compelling significant changes to practices. So this is a desire expressed universally by survivors so that others shouldn't have to experience or endure what they have experienced. Also appealing to politicians who have the power to decide on further actions of redress, and also forming the basis of public and personal apology. So the point is that truth-telling and testimony must go somewhere. The Royal Commission is charged with making recommendations for action, which are being taken up by the Crown Response Unit. And that includes a survivor-led high-level design of a redress system. So providing personal apologies and monetary redress are two of the key functions of that proposed system. And our redress design proposals, as well as proposals for public apology, are currently with the Minister for the Public Service. So as Jack and Josiah have demonstrated in their kōrero, for apology to be meaningful and restorative, it must be responsive to and negotiated with those receiving it. And in Aotearoa New Zealand, we have processes from Te Ao Māori dedicated to restorative justice, and they are apt given the disproportionate numbers of Māori survivors. But survivors have experiences that are part of, but also distinct from the hara experienced by iwi and hapu. And so an apology process that draws on tikanga must be cognizant of that. So the concept of take utu ia gives us a framework for public and personal apologies as well as wider redress. So in terms of take for survivors, this is the abuse and harms that they've experienced, which constitute the perpetrator's transgressions that must be apologised for. And that acknowledgement needs to be sufficiently specific to apply to details of the individual in the case of personal apologies, but also to encompass the breadth of abuse experiences for a range of cohorts or groupings of survivors in the case of public apology. The content of apology must also include some explanatory narrative or explanation of why offences were wrong in the first place. That's part of demonstrating perpetrator awareness. And so there's a lot of discussion needed to reach a common understanding of the injustices, and that has to include obstruction of justice and failure to act in order to construct an agreed narrative for apology. And so survivors have to be front and centre. In terms of utu, with respect to apology, this applies to both the content and the delivery that survivors deem appropriate and meaningful, including the commitment of the perpetrator to acknowledging and accepting responsibility, expressing genuine apology, attempting to address injustices, and also to commit no further transgressions. And so importantly within that, survivors should also be entitled to a right of reply where that is their wish. Important sort of notion of utu is it's also about obtaining an equivalent. So it should be in the spirit of generosity rather than looking to limit liability. Now, when we come to air, this is difficult. Issues of liability and natural justice mean that there will be limitations as to what may be achieved via apology. And also survivors know there's no undoing of their experiences. There's no restoring them to a state prior to the abuse and harms. And so at best, public apology may deliver moral recognition rather than justice or complete healing. So apology is a symbolic act, but it can and must also be more than that. The genuineness of an apology will be judged by the actions that follow. And so to move beyond being symbolic and performative, there have to be discernible changes to processes, practices, and systems, a real commitment to ending the harms associated with closed adoption and state and faith-based care. According to philosopher and ethicist Jana Thompson, an official apology is supposed to constitute a watershed in the history of relations between a government and a group of wronged individuals. It's supposed to separate a past of injustice and indifference into a future of just dealings and respect. And so changes have to be non-partisan. They must endure beyond any particular government. And this is challenging, especially if political ideology is bound up with approaches that are harmful. So apology is also an act of reconciliation, but reconciliation is a much larger process that may proceed and extend beyond formal action, such as the work of the Royal Commission and redress. And each of these steps can progress, but not necessarily guarantee reconciliation as an outcome. As we continue to move forward, I suggest that it's the healing and well-being of survivors and following generations that is the ultimate yardstick. This is when we can be truly assured, kua ia. Kia ora.
Wow, thank you. Thank you very much. That was a deeply humbling kōrero to listen to. All three of you have brought things I would never have thought of and that are absolutely central to this issue. And I just wanted to just take the last 15 minutes or so to engage with the people and also to hear more from all three of you. And I haven't seen any questions in the Q&A yet, so don't be afraid, people, but I have questions. And I think one of the things I'd like to just expand on is Moana Jackson often used the word restoration as a positive word for where we're going. So what I'd like to hear is about how you see, despite the flawed nature of the Crown's position in virtually all circumstances relating to redress, where does the strength to keep fighting for restoration come from? And I'd just like to go back to you, Annabelle, because you said something amazing in the conversation the other day when offline, when you talked about not having, the survivors not having the strength of their whakapapa as a unifying point of view or of anything except an experience of deep injustice. So survivor of justice being the only unifying kōrero, and how that affects the ability to keep struggling for what is clearly unfinished business. And then I'd love to hear from you other two about where that strength does come from within your cultural frameworks. Kia ora.
Yeah, I mean, I think just being part of some of this mahi with others, you know, and I guess comparing and thinking about other apologies for other collectives. I think, you know, it is hard. I think survivors as a community cohere in various contexts, self-organizing in small pockets. But, you know, that identity is grounded in grievance and trauma. And I think there's also considerable diversity. So, and I think many survivors, you know, they've been waiting a long time for this. So many people have already started their own processes of healing, of restoration. They can't wait for the Crown on this one, but we know the Crown has a critical role to play too. So people have already sort of navigated some of that. They've grappled with, you know, where's my source of strength, positive identity, and many of them then bring that into the survivor space. But I think where that sort of led me is thinking for us, I think there's value in the and. So being able to pursue redress, healing as individuals, in terms of what we might need as unique individuals, but also in the collective. Yeah.
Kia ora. Jack, what would you say gives the strength to carry on, given your comments about the tokenism of sorry?
I mean, it really just comes down to the kōrero of, you know, ka whawhai tonu mātou ake. It is a never-ending struggle, a struggle without end, and that needs to be picked up by each new generation in the context and in which they are surviving through. And as Indigenous peoples, we don't look, you know, months or years or decades ahead. We look generations ahead, and how do we plant the seeds for the ongoing struggle that we have picked up from our tupuna. And I just wanted to reflect on something Mike Tana put in the chat about this idea of collective forgetting. And I think that's a really important kōrero, because part of the reason, also linking to his other question around this current government, part of the reason this current government can get away with such an outright assault on Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the progress that we have made as tangata whenua is because the settlements were, and the redress process was never used by the Crown as an opportunity for public education or for actually, embedding this historical context within contemporary discourse. Rather, it was seen as more of a tick box exercise that they needed to rush through and get done full in this idea of full and final, so that their Pākehā guilt could be assuaged, and so that they could get this out of the public consciousness, so that it could be pushed aside and essentially forgotten about. Of course, as activists have always, and as tangata whenua have always said, these can never be full and final settlements, because new generations will bring up new kōrero, and will continue to fight for the 100% rather than the 0.1% or whatever that has been returned to us from what was stolen. So yeah, I guess that's my kōrero, is that it's nothing new for us as tangata whenua. It is certainly taking us back a long way, this current government, and we're having to fight for the very foundations of what our tupuna have fought for. But at the end of the day, they are, in my view, representing a dying generation, and you see it in the cultural fabric of younger generations across cultures. Tangata moana, tangata tiriti, tangata whenua are uniting to create a new reality, and one which does not forget its past, but also actually tries to implement rather than settle Te Tiriti, as many of our rangatira like Moana Jackson have told us. Te Tiriti and settle and treaties are meant to be implemented, not settled. So I'll finish with that. Kia ora.
Kia ora, yeah. Honoured, not settled. That's the kaupapa. Josiah, did you want to comment a little bit on the question in terms of your people, the apologies and the unfinished business, just briefly? And we have had a couple of other parts I come in, so I'd like to get to them, so we'll just keep it tight. Kia ora.
Yep. Strength comes from our whanaungatanga between tangata whenua and tangata moana. I look at what mātua here are able to do and have done, and the love for us. I think that I have an obligation as, yes, we're whanaunga, but that doesn't mean we relax. We need to get more busy because we have to support our whanaungatanga. And also as a New Zealand-based, as Aotearoa-based Pacific person, I'm also always very concerned about New Zealand Inc.'s response and support in the Pacific region. And so I see our community here as being able to support as a conscience in that context.
Kia ora. Thank you very much, Josiah. We've got a question here. I think it's specifically to you, Annabelle, from Moana Waitoki. Kia ora koutou katoa. What do you think are critical to apologies from a professional group like psychiatrists and Lake Alice psychological societies who apologise harm through I can't even say it, I can't say it, racism, systematic racism, or classification systems. Ngā mihi.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And obviously that a reference to a fairly recent apology. I guess I think what's key in that is the acknowledgement for professions that they were part and parcel of this. So they may not, certainly in terms of psychiatry, many of those practitioners may not have perpetuated abuse themselves, or perpetrated abuse, sorry, but it was the actions of the profession in, ignoring complaints, being inactive, not taking action. And so I think that there was very little, there has been very little acknowledgement of that to make that meaningful for survivors. But absolutely, there's more work to be done, I guess, deeper reflection. And I think that particular apology may have centered primarily around the actions of one individual. And it's sort of about people taking responsibility at that broader level. It's very easy to let yourself off the hook by saying that wasn't me, that was that person back then. But that doesn't get us any closer to reconciliation.
Kia ora. Thank you very much. The other part we have here is for you, Jack, which is nā ka nui te mihi ki nā kai kōrero, a timely and necessary kōrero. I'd love to hear a little more from Jack about the settlement process between Parihaka and the Crown, if possible. So if you wanted to, Jack, we've only got a couple of more minutes before we finish, but I think it would be really lovely just because Parihaka lives so powerfully in our imaginations nationally and internationally. If you could talk a little bit about your perspective on that settlement.
Ka pai. So I'm by no means an expert on the settlement, and I acknowledge all of our leaders from Parihaka who led that process. But the one thing that I would say is that what made that reconciliation process successful, in my view, was the willingness of the Crown to actually renegotiate the framework in which it was negotiated, and so that it wasn't within the strict confines of the treaty settlement process, and that it could look at setting new precedent and a new way of doing things, and actually that was actually place and kaupapa specific in terms of the history that occurred to our people at Parihaka. And I just wanted to also say in relation to that I've heard kōrero recently from one of our rangatira, Ruakere Hond, that there is a lot of fear that process is threatened under this current government, because the current government has said that they will not undo settlements, and that settlements will be protected insofar as they can actually guarantee that. But because this lies outside of that process, there is a fear that it could be threatened. And so I would just say to everyone here that we need to remain mindful of these instances of where the Crown is seeking to undermine the progress that has been made. We're in that stage where it's very difficult to fight for further progress because we're constantly having to go back and protect what has already been achieved. And so I'm going to be keeping an eye out for further kōrero from our people on that, in terms of ways that we can support to protect that process. And I think it really also speaks to, just to tie into the broad concept of this wānanga, it speaks to the limitations of apology, and the fact that apologies should be the starting point, not the end point, and that the redress and the reconciliation and the restoration that continues from that should be the primary focus, not just the act of saying sorry, which can be very hollow and to be honest, sometimes meaningless. As Annabelle has, really eloquently said, it has to be based on tikanga, it has to be based on experience and on action. So, yeah, kia ora.
Oh, kia ora. Thank you so much, everybody. We're nearly right at the end, but Annabelle, please, kōrero.
I've just been thinking a little bit more. Moana, your question has got me thinking. I think there's, that's a much bigger conversation, but actually in relation to psychology, psychiatry, affiliated professions, I think we use this term trauma-informed. And I think what I'd like to see, that needs to be specific to particular spaces. So in this case, I guess each of those professions with respect to survivors, I think need to be guided. It needs to be survivor-led, trauma-informed practice. Yeah.
Kia ora. And I think whether you're a survivor or a hapu or an entire Samoan nation, your voice, your rights, your history and your definition of appropriate redress should rule rather than the Crown. So I think we've heard from all three of you the limitations and the strengths of what's happened so far and how much more that there is to be done. And I was very moved by all of it. And I just hope that lots of people heard you, and I'm glad this is recorded because this is the history and you are the leaders that are taking on some of the toughest issues in Aotearoa. And we need to learn from the people who have the experience in every sense of the word. So thank you so much, everybody. And I wondered, Jack, if you could close our hui for us. And this will be available online to reflect on. And I want you all who are listening to hold in your hearts these three amazing leaders for what they've given us today. Kia ora koutou. Kia ora, Jack.
Ka pai, au i te tuatahi ka mihi au ki a koe, Catherine, kua arahi i a tātou kōrero, me ngā tangata katoa o tēnei kaupapa, kua whakarite me te tautoko ki te whakahaere i tēnei wānanga i te ata nei, no reira ki a koutou o Tiriti Futures, tēnei te mihi ki a koutou. Kia hau nei, he hohonu te wānanga i te ata nei, he tino whakahirehira nā kōrero kua puta. No reira, ko te tumanako, ka hoki ai tātou katoa, ki a tātou hāpori, ki a tātou whānau, hapu iwi rānei, ki te whakatō i ēnei mātauranga, ki roto i ngā mahi o tātou kei mua i te aroaro. No reira, e ai ki te kōrero, mā te huruhuru karere te manu, nā reira, hoki ai tātou, ki ngā tōpito te whenua, kia whakatō i ēnei mātauranga ki roto i ngā hāpori o te motu. No reira, i rungi tērā whakaaro, unuhia i te urutapu nui a tāne, kia wātea, te māma, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua i te arataka tū, kia wātea, ai rā, kua wātea, re hau, pai marire.
Pai marire, kia ora.